Bets placed at the local saloon gave her exactly 4 days before she'd pack her silk trunks and flee back to Philadelphia. Stepping into the suffocating dust of the Bruneau Valley in 1883, Josephine looked every inch the fragile Eastern spinster. She had been sent through a matrimonial agency to Wyatt, a hardened, widowed rancher raising 3 wild children on a ruined homestead. Locals expected her to break, eagerly anticipating tears and a quick retreat. But by the end of her first week, Josephine hadn't just survived the hostile wilderness, she did something so shocking it would be whispered about for a century. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in front of the mercantile, kicking up a cloud of alkaline dust that coated the rough-hewn timber of the town of Silver City. Celeste Miller adjusted her veil, coughing softly into a linen handkerchief. At 26, she was considered well past her prime in the high society parlors of the East Coast. But out here, in the sprawling, unforgiving Idaho Territory, she was an anomaly. She stepped down onto the boardwalk, her leather boots sinking slightly into the dry earth. She carried a single carpet bag. Her heavier trunks were strapped to the roof of the coach. Celeste stood in the afternoon sun, waiting for a man she knew only from 2 stilted letters and a tintype photograph. Stony Rutherford. An hour passed. The sun began its slow dip behind the jagged peaks of the Owyhee Mountains. The few locals wandering the streets stopped to stare. A woman named Martha Higgins, sweeping the porch of the boarding house across the street, paused to lean on her broom, her eyes narrowing with predatory curiosity. "You waiting on someone, miss?" the station master finally asked, spitting a stream of dark tobacco into a brass spittoon. "Mr. Stony Rutherford," Celeste said, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "He was expecting me." The station master stopped chewing. A long, uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "Stony, you the mail order lady? I am his betrothed, yes." The man let out a low, rough laugh that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in a pine board. "Well, ma'am, Stony ain't here. Hasn't been to town in a month. He's out at the Bitter Creek spread. It's a 5-mile ride, and he didn't send a wagon." Celeste did not weep. She did not wring her hands. Back in Philadelphia, she had navigated boardrooms and handled her late father's aggressive creditors until there was nothing left but a mountain of debt and a tarnished family name. She had not crossed the country to be defeated by a missed appointment. "Then I will need to hire a wagon," Celeste said smoothly, reaching into her reticule to produce a silver dollar. "Who can take me?" It took another hour to secure a rattling buckboard driven by a teenager named Billy. The ride to Bitter Creek was brutal. The landscape was a sprawling ocean of gray-green sagebrush, broken only by jagged basalt outcroppings and the deep, treacherous cuts of dry washes. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on Celeste's shoulders like a physical weight. As they crested a ridge, the Rutherford Ranch came into view. Celeste's breath caught, but not from awe. The property was a portrait of neglect. The main house was a rambling structure of weathered timber, its porch sagging under the weight of a collapsed roof beam. The corrals were patched with mismatched wood, and a rusty plow sat abandoned in a field of weeds. "Here you are, ma'am," Billy muttered, looking eager to leave. He helped her down with her trunks and quickly spurred his horses, fleeing the desolate property. Celeste stood alone in the yard. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn. Before she could approach the porch, the front door creaked open. 3 figures emerged, looking less like children and more like cornered wildlife. The eldest, a girl of about 12, held a heavy iron fireplace poker. Her hair was a tangled rat's nest of blonde curls, her face smeared with soot. Behind her stood a boy of 8, his eyes wide and vacant, clutching the girl's ragged dress. Peeking from behind the doorframe was a toddler, no more than 4, wearing only a soiled linen shirt. "Who are you?" the girl demanded, raising the poker. "I am Celeste." "You must be Abigail," Celeste said, keeping her tone perfectly even. "And this is Samuel and Levi." "We don't need no new mother," Abigail spat, her eyes flashing with a raw, feral grief. "Pa didn't tell us you were coming." "That appears to be a common theme today," Celeste murmured. "Where is your father?" "Out branding," Abigail said defensively. "He won't be back till sundown. You should leave before he gets here." I have traveled 2,000 miles, Abigail. I am not turning back. Celeste picked up her carpet bag and walked directly toward the girl. Abigail stiffened, raising the poker higher, but Celeste merely sidestepped her, moving into the dim, sweltering interior of the cabin. The stench hit her first, a mix of stale sweat, spoiled milk, and wood smoke. The cabin was a disaster. Unwashed cast iron pans piled high in a tin basin, clothes were strewn across the dirt-caked floorboards, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. It was the home of a man who had entirely given up. Celeste set her bag down on the only clean surface she could find, a heavy oak dining table. She rolled up the sleeves of her tailored broadcloth dress. When Stony Rutherford finally rode into the yard at dusk, he was exhausted to the bone. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face deeply lined from sun and sorrow, his dark beard overgrown. He dismounted his roan gelding, expecting the usual chaotic silence of his ruined home. Instead, he opened the door to the smell of boiling lye soap, roasting potatoes, and scrubbed wood. Celeste stood by the hearth, her face flushed from the heat of the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot. The three children were sitting at the table, remarkably quiet, staring at her as if she were a ghost. Stony froze in the doorway, taking off his battered Stetson. He looked at the clean floor, the washed children, and the strange woman in his kitchen. "You're late, Mr. Rutherford," Celeste said, not looking up from the stove. "Dinner is ready. Go wash your hands." Stony did not apologize for missing her arrival. He ate his dinner in grueling silence, his eyes darting to Celeste whenever he thought she wasn't looking. He had sent for a bride in a moment of desperate weakness, terrified that the county orphanage would take his children. He had expected a sturdy, plain-faced farm girl, someone grateful for a roof. Instead, he had gotten a regal, sharp-eyed woman who looked at his squalor not with pity, but with a terrifying, cold calculation. The first 3 days were a battlefield. Stony left before dawn and returned after dark, retreating into his grief and the endless labor of the ranch, deliberately leaving Celeste to the mercy of his feral offspring. Abigail was the commanding general of the resistance. She was determined to drive the intruder out. On Celeste's second morning, she awoke to find her only pair of leather riding boots filled to the brim with wet, foul-smelling horse manure. Celeste did not scream. She did not complain to Stony. She carried the boots to the yard, cleaned them meticulously at the pump, and set them in the sun to dry. Then, she walked to the barn where Abigail was hiding in the hayloft. "If you ruin my footwear, Abigail, you will be the one walking 5 miles to town to fetch the flour," Celeste said, her voice carrying up to the rafters, calm and icy. "I suggest you find a more productive use of your time." On the third day, the real test occurred. Celeste was in the yard, attempting to hang the heavy, wet laundry on a line strung between the porch and a dead cottonwood tree. Stony and his only hired hand, an old, bow-legged cowboy named Horace, were mending a corral fence nearby. Suddenly, a sharp, terrified scream tore through the air. It was Samuel. The 8-year-old had wandered too close to the woodpile. Celeste dropped the wet sheets, sprinting toward the sound. Coiled atop the stacked logs, thick and dusty brown, was a massive timber rattlesnake. Its tail was a blur of motion, the high-pitched rattle sounding like a chorus of angry cicadas. Samuel was frozen, trapped in the corner of the woodpile, less than 2 feet from the striking zone. Stony yelled out, dropping his tools and running, but he was too far away. Horace fumbled for the revolver at his hip, but his arthritic hands were clumsy. Celeste did not hesitate. As she ran past the porch, she grabbed the heavy, long-handled iron spade resting against the steps. She didn't slow down. With a fluid, powerful motion that betrayed a shocking amount of upper-body strength, she swung the heavy spade like an executioner's axe. The edge of the iron shovel struck the woodpile with a deafening crack, instantly severing the snake's head from its thick body. The headless coil writhed violently, falling into the dirt. Celeste dropped the spade, instantly dropping to her knees and pulling Samuel into her arms. The boy, who hadn't spoken a word since his mother died 18 months prior, buried his face in Celeste's neck and began to sob. Stony slid to a halt just inches away, his chest heaving. He stared at the cleanly decapitated snake, then at Celeste, who was gently rocking his traumatized son, her expensive dress now stained with dirt and snake blood. Where in the hell did a lady from Philadelphia learn to swing a shovel like that? Stoney rasped, his voice rough with shock and adrenaline. Celeste looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing. "I was not always a lady of leisure, Mr. Rutherford, and I strongly suggest you clear the brush around your woodpile before your children are killed." That evening, the dynamic shifted. Stoney lingered at the table after dinner. He watched Celeste patch a hole in Levi's trousers by the light of a kerosene lamp. "I should have been at the stage depot," Stoney finally said. It was the closest thing to an apology he had offered. "My wife, Sarah, she died of the fever. It took her in 3 days. After that, things just fell apart." "Grief is a heavy burden, Stoney," Celeste replied softly, biting the end of her thread. "But it is not an excuse to let your children run wild and your home rot. You sent for a partner. I am here, but I will not be a ghost in this house." Stoney looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Beneath the refined exterior was a core of absolute iron. "Why did you come out here, Celeste? A woman like you. You didn't have to marry a dirt-poor widower." Celeste paused, her needle hovering over the fabric. "My father was a banker," she said quietly. "He made terrible investments. When he died, he left us in ruin. I worked as a bookkeeper in a factory for 3 years to pay off his debts, surrounded by men who looked at me like I was a piece of meat. I came west because I wanted land. I wanted a place that belonged to me, where I couldn't be evicted by the stroke of a pen. I am looking for a life, Stoney, not a fairy tale." By the end of the first week, word had reached Silver City that the mail-order bride hadn't fled. In fact, rumors were swirling. Old Horace had gone into town for tobacco and couldn't stop talking about how the Eastern woman had chopped a rattler in half and scrubbed the Rutherford house so clean you could eat off the floorboards. Sunday arrived, and Celeste insisted they attend the small community church in town. It was a strategic move. She knew the entire valley was waiting for her to fail, and she intended to show them her strength. Stoney fought her on it. "I don't hold with church much anymore," he grumbled, shaving his beard for the first time in months. "The town likes to talk. Let them talk," Celeste said, buttoning Levi into a freshly washed and mended shirt. "But they will look us in the eye when they do it." The Rutherford wagon pulled into the churchyard just as the bell began to toll. The transformation was startling. Stoney, clean-shaven and wearing his only dark suit, looked commanding. The children, previously known as the dirty terrors of the valley, were scrubbed clean, their hair combed, walking in an orderly line. And leading them was Celeste, wearing a modest but exquisitely tailored dark blue dress, walking with the posture of a queen. As they walked down the aisle to a pew near the front, the silence in the church was deafening. Whispers broke out like a brush fire. Martha Higgins, sitting 2 rows back, nearly dropped her hymnal. After the service, the congregation gathered in the dusty yard beneath the shade of the oak trees. Celeste stood by the wagon, holding Levi, while Stoney spoke awkwardly with the minister. That was when Jebediah Sterling made his move. Jeb was the wealthiest cattle baron in Owyhee County. He owned the massive Crossed Keys ranch that bordered Stoney's property. Jeb had been trying to buy the Bitter Creek Ranch for pennies on the dollar ever since Sarah died, knowing Stoney was drowning in debt and despair. Jeb was a large, imposing man with a silver mustache and a ruthless reputation. He strutted over to the Rutherford wagon, surrounded by a few of his sycophantic ranch hands. He completely ignored Stoney, aiming his predatory gaze directly at Celeste. "Well, now," Jeb boomed, his voice carrying over the chatter of the crowd. "I heard Stoney bought himself a city pet. Can't say I expected you to last the week, little lady. How are you liking the dirt and the flies?" Celeste turned slowly. She looked Jeb up and down, her expression completely unreadable. "I find the dirt manageable, Mr. Sterling. It's the local pests that are the true nuisance." A few people nearby gasped. Jeb's smile tightened into a sneer. "Sharp tongue," Jeb said, stepping closer, invading her personal space. Stoney always did have a knack for acquiring things he couldn't handle. Speaking of which, Stoney, Jeb shifted his gaze to the widowed cowboy. That note on your western pasture is due at the Territorial Bank next month. We both know you don't have the coin. Sell to me now, and I'll give you enough to buy your pretty new wife a train ticket back to civilization. Stoney's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. He took a step forward, ready to strike the man, but Celeste placed a gentle, restraining hand on Stoney's arm. "Mr. Sterling," Celeste said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent churchyard. "It is my understanding that the Western Pasture Note is held under the Homestead Act of 1862. As such, any debt incurred by a single claimant is subject to renegotiation upon the establishment of a legal marriage and the addition of a secondary deed holder." Jeb blinked, thrown off balance. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I am talking about the law, Mr. Sterling," Celeste said, stepping forward, her eyes locked onto his. "Before I left Philadelphia, I had Stoney wire me the details of his property lines and encumbrances. We signed our legal marriage certificate by proxy 3 weeks ago. My name is now on the deed. I spent 3 years working as a financial ledger clerk for one of the largest shipping firms on the East Coast. I know exactly how to restructure an agricultural loan, and I have already wired the Territorial Bank in Boise. The debt has been rolled over into a 5-year fixed-term note. Stoney doesn't owe you, or the bank, a single dime this month." The silence in the yard was absolute. Even Stoney looked at her in stunned disbelief. He hadn't known she possessed such knowledge, nor had he fully understood the legal papers she had demanded he sign before her arrival. Jeb Sterling's face turned a violent shade of purple. He opened his mouth to speak, but found he had no counter-argument. He had been outmaneuvered by a woman in a velvet-trimmed hat. "If you will excuse us," Celeste said smoothly, turning back to the wagon. "We have a ranch to run. Come along, Stoney." Children, as the wagon rolled out of the churchyard, leaving the dumbfounded townspeople in their dust, Stoney stared at Celeste, holding the reins loosely in his hands. You restructured my bank loan?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Celeste looked straight ahead, a tiny, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I told you, Stoney. I am building a life here, and I do not intend to let any man take my land." The valley had expected a fragile flower. Instead, they had imported a woman made of steel, and as the wagon bumped along the rugged trail back to Bitter Creek, Stoney Rutherford realized with a jolt of terrifying, thrilling clarity that his life was never, ever going to be the same. Romance in the Bruneau Valley was not built on whispered poetry or moonlit strolls. It was forged in the brutal crucible of survival. After the confrontation in the churchyard, the dynamic at the Bitter Creek Ranch irrevocably shifted. Stoney Rutherford no longer looked at his new wife as a desperate, temporary fix to his domestic nightmare. He looked at her as a commanding officer. The morning after their victory over Jebediah Sterling, Celeste commandeered a corner of the main room. She dragged Stoney's scarred oak desk away from the wall, dusted it meticulously, and unpacked her leather-bound ledgers, a brass inkwell, and a stack of crisp, ruled paper. "Sit down, Stoney," she ordered after breakfast, smoothing her apron. "We are going to perform an autopsy on this ranch." For the next 3 days, while Horace and Stoney managed the Hereford herd out in the scrub brush, Celeste untangled the financial ruin of the Rutherford estate. The reality was grim. Stoney had been purchasing supplies on credit at exorbitant interest rates from the mercantile in Silver City. His cattle yields were dropping because he couldn't afford enough winter feed, and he was hemorrhaging money on broken equipment he lacked the time to repair. But Celeste also found salvation buried in the mess. Stoney owned the deed to a natural spring in the Upper Canyon that he had never fully utilized, and he had a surplus of timber that could be milled and sold. Late one evening, as the kerosene lamp cast long shadows across the cabin walls, Stoney sat across from her at the desk. He watched her long, elegant fingers trace the columns of numbers. He noticed, for the first time, how the harsh western sun had brought a dusting of freckles to the bridge of her nose, softening her severe eastern pallor. "You're working yourself to the bone, Celeste." Stoney said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He reached out, his calloused, weather-beaten hand lightly touching the sleeve of her dress. You didn't sign on to be my accountant. Celeste looked up, her dark eyes catching the lamplight. The heat radiating from his hand sent a startling, unfamiliar shiver up her arm. I signed on to be your partner, Stoney. A partnership requires equal weight. You carry the physical burden of this land. I will carry the mathematical one. She paused, looking toward the loft where the children slept. Speaking of partnerships, Abigail is bright, brighter than she lets on. I caught her looking at the Montgomery Ward catalog today. She was calculating the cost of winter coats in her head, adding the freight charges. Stoney sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Abigail hasn't been a child since Sarah died. She took on too much. Then we will give her a new task, Celeste decided. One that doesn't involve her hating me. The next afternoon, Celeste did not send Abigail out to muck the stalls. Instead, she called the defiant 12-year-old to the desk. I need an assistant, Celeste said plainly, ignoring the girl's suspicious scowl. Your father's handwriting is atrocious, and I cannot keep track of the grain inventory alone. If you help me balance these ledgers, I will pay you a wage of 20 cents a week. Your own money, Abigail. To order whatever you wish from the catalog. Abigail stared at the ledger, then at Celeste. The feral hostility in her eyes flickered, replaced by a calculating gleam that looked entirely too much like her new stepmother's. 25 cents, the girl bargained, her voice cracking slightly. Celeste a smile. Done. It was a truce, fragile but real. Celeste taught Abigail how to run double-entry bookkeeping, and in return, the girl stopped putting salt in Celeste's tea. Even Samuel, the silent ghost of a boy, began to shadow Celeste around the yard, carrying her basket when she gathered eggs from the dilapidated coop. But out in the valley, the humiliation of Jebediah Sterling was festering. A man who owned half of Owyhee County did not take kindly to being outsmarted by a woman in front of his peers. Jeb was a creature of pride and venom, and he had decided that if he couldn't buy Stoney Rutherford out, he would choke him out. The first sign of trouble came on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. The wind had died down, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. Old Horace came riding into the yard at a breakneck gallop, his horse lathered in sweat. He didn't even bother to dismount before he started shouting. Stoney! Boss, get out here! Horace bellowed, coughing on the dust. Stoney burst from the barn, a branding iron still in his hand. Celeste stepped out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. It's the creek, Horace gasped, pointing toward the southern horizon. The lower basin is bone dry. The cattle down there are bawling, knee-deep in mud. The water just stopped flowing. Stoney's face drained of color. The lower basin was fed by a tributary of Bitter Creek that wound down from the foothills that bordered Jeb Sterling's property. Without that water, the herd in the lower pasture would die of thirst within days in the 90-degree heat. Damn it to hell, Stoney swore, throwing the branding iron into the dirt. Jeb damned the creek. He's cutting off our water. He can't do that, Celeste said, stepping off the porch, her voice slicing through Stoney's panic. Those are public grazing lands above our property line, but we hold the prior appropriation rights to that water. Celeste, out here. The law is written by the man with the most guns. Stoney growled, turning toward the house. I'm getting my Winchester. Horace, saddle the roan. Saddle the mare for me, Celeste ordered, her tone brooking absolutely no argument. Stoney stopped dead in his tracks. Like hell. You are staying here with the children. Sterling's men are rough, Celeste. They aren't going to care about your ledgers or your banknotes. Celeste walked up to him, stopping inches from his chest. She tilted her head back to look him dead in the eye. If you ride up there with a rifle and shoot one of his men, Jeb Sterling will have the sheriff hang you for murder, and he will take this ranch anyway. You need a witness. You need the law. And I am coming with you. For a long, tense moment, Stoney stared down at her. He saw the unyielding resolve in her posture, the fire in her dark eyes. He realized then, with a mixture of terror and profound awe, that his eastern bride was the most dangerous creature in the territory. "Fine," Stoney gritted out, "but you stay behind me." The ride into the foothills was punishing. Celeste, eschewing the side saddle she had brought from Philadelphia, rode astride the bay mare, her skirts hitched up and her jaw set. The alkali dust coated her throat, and the sun beat down relentlessly. But she did not complain. 2 miles past their property line, nestled in a narrow, rocky ravine, they found the problem. A crude but effective earthen dam had been constructed across the neck of the creek, choking off the water flow and diverting it into a dry gulch that ran back toward the Crossed Keys Ranch. Standing guard over the barricade were 3 men on horseback. Leading them was Hiram Cobb, Sterling's notoriously brutal foreman, a man with a scarred cheek and a cold, dead-eyed stare. As Stoney, Celeste, and Horace approached, Hiram rested his hand on the butt of the Colt revolver, holstered at his hip. "Far enough, Rutherford," Hiram called out, spitting tobacco juice onto the rocks. "You're trespassing on Mr. Sterling's grazing lease." Stoney halted his roan, his hand tight on the Winchester resting across his saddle pommel. "That water flows down to my basin, Cobb. You're starving my herd. Tear down the dam." Hiram chuckled, a sound like grinding stones. "Mr. Sterling decided he needs this water for his own herd. Seeing as how he leases this land from the territory, he figures he's got the right to improve it." Stoney raised the rifle an inch. "I said, tear it down." The 2 men flanking Hiram drew their weapons. The metallic clack-clack of hammers pulling back echoed off the canyon walls. Horace swallowed hard, his hands shaking on his reins. It was 3 against 2, and Horace was no gunfighter. Before Stoney could make a fatal mistake, Celeste kicked her mare forward, pushing her horse between Stoney and the foreman. "Mrs. Rutherford," Hiram sneered, looking her up and down with blatant disrespect. "This ain't a parlor. You'd best get back to your knitting before there's blood on your pretty dress." "My dress is quite durable, Mr. Cobb," Celeste said, her voice carrying a chilling, aristocratic authority that echoed strangely in the wild canyon. "I am not here to knit. I am here to inform you that you are currently in violation of the Colorado Doctrine, which governs the water rights of this territory. My husband holds the patent on the Bitter Creek property, which was established in 1874. Under the law of prior appropriation, first in time is first in right. Your employer's grazing lease does not supersede our established, beneficial use of this water." Hiram blinked, momentarily disoriented by the barrage of legal terminology. "I don't give a damn about no doctrines, lady. Mr. Sterling gives the orders." "Mr. Sterling is not above the federal government," Celeste countered smoothly, reaching into her saddlebag. She pulled out a thick, official-looking document bound in red ribbon. She didn't mention that it was actually a copy of her late father's life insurance policy. She simply held it aloft like a weapon. "I have already drafted an injunction. If this dam is not dismantled immediately, I will ride to the telegraph office in Silver City and wire the United States Marshals in Boise. I will charge Jebediah Sterling, and you 3 men personally, with federal water theft and malicious destruction of livestock." She leaned forward over her saddle, locking eyes with the foreman. "The local sheriff might be in Sterling's pocket, Mr. Cobb, but the federal marshals are not. Are you prepared to face a federal judge and a territorial prison sentence for a man who pays you $30 a month?" The canyon fell dead silent, save for the wind whistling through the sagebrush. Hiram Cobb looked at the document, then at Celeste's unflinching gaze. He was a violent man, but he wasn't a fool. Shooting a local rancher over a dispute was one thing. Shooting an educated woman wielding federal threats was a guaranteed way to bring the United States cavalry down on their heads. Jeb Sterling hadn't paid them enough to swing from a rope. Hiram's jaw worked furiously. He looked at Stoney, who was staring at his wife in unabashed shock, and then backed his horse up a few paces. "This ain't over, Rutherford," Hiram spat. He jerked his head at his men. "Let's ride. The boss will handle this legal nonsense himself." The 3 men wheeled their horses around and galloped up the ravine, disappearing into a cloud of dust. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded, Stoney let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a year. He slowly lowered his rifle and slid it back into the scabbard. He looked at Celeste, who was quietly tucking the red-ribboned paper back into her saddlebag. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling ever so slightly. "You bluffed, Hiram Cobb," Stoney said, his voice thick with a chaotic mix of relief and reverence. "You stared down 3 loaded guns with a piece of paper." Celeste took a deep, shuddering breath, the adrenaline finally crashing through her system. "I did not bluff about the law, Stoney. I only bluffed about having the injunction ready. Now, get down. We have a dam to break." Stoney and Horace dismounted, grabbing shovels and picks from their saddle packs. Celeste slid down from her mare, her boots hitting the mud. Stoney tried to stop her as she waded into the murky water toward the earthen barrier, but she simply rolled up her sleeves. For the next hour, they worked side by side in the sweltering heat. The mud ruined Celeste's skirt, plastering it to her legs. Her hands blistered under the rough wood of the shovel handle, but she matched Stoney shovel for shovel, tearing away the dirt and rocks until the pressure of the blocked creek finally shattered the dam. A rush of cold, brown water surged forward, flooding down the ravine toward the lower basin. Celeste dropped her shovel, exhausted, breathing heavily. She lost her footing in the slick mud and stumbled backward. Stoney dropped his pickaxe and lunged, catching her by the waist before she hit the water. He pulled her flush against his chest, stabilizing her. They stood there in the rushing creek, soaked in muddy water and sweat. Celeste looked up at him. His hat had fallen off, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes were intensely focused, boring into hers, stripped of all the grief and weariness that had clouded them for 18 months. He was looking at her not as a convenience, and not just as a partner, but as a woman. "You," Stoney murmured, his voice rough, his hands tightening on her waist, "are a terrifying, magnificent creature, Celeste Rutherford." Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs, entirely unrelated to the physical exertion. "I told you, Stoney. I am fighting for my home. Our home," he corrected softly. He didn't ask for permission. Stoney leaned down and kissed her. It was not a gentle, polite Eastern kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and tasting of alkaline dust and raw survival. For a second, Celeste froze, but then she dropped the heavy shovel and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with a fierce, unexpected passion that matched his own. Up on the bank, old Horace politely turned his back, pretending to check his horse's cinch, a wide, toothless grin spreading across his weathered face. The mail-order bride hadn't just saved the herd. She had brought Stoney Rutherford back to life. But as they rode back to the ranch, hand in hand, Celeste knew the war was far from won. Jeb Sterling was a rattlesnake, and by breaking his dam, Celeste had just stepped squarely on his tail. The retribution of Jebediah Montgomery did not come through the marbled halls of the territorial courts, nor did it announce itself in the honest light of day. It came on a moonless Thursday night, carried on the back of the dry, howling winds that swept down mercilessly from the jagged peaks of the Owyhee Mountains. The household had finally settled into a deeply restless sleep. The adrenaline from the confrontation at the dam had faded, leaving behind an exhausting ache in their bones. In the shadowed loft above, 12-year-old Abigail lay awake, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling planks. Beneath her pillow rested the heavy brass key to the grain ledger, a profound symbol of the fragile truce she had struck with her new stepmother. Downstairs, the rancher and his Eastern bride slept in their separate, makeshift quarters. Josephine in the small, hastily partitioned room off the sweltering kitchen, Wyatt on the heavy canvas cot positioned near the cooling hearth. The kiss they had shared earlier that afternoon, standing knee-deep in the muddy, rushing water of the broken dam, hung palpably in the stifling air between them. It was a silent, heavy promise, a sudden ignition of something desperate and real, yet neither had found the breath or the courage to address it before the sun went down. At 2 a.m, the heavy silence of the frontier was violently shattered. The ranch dog, a scruffy, battle-scarred terrier mix named Barnaby, began to bark frantically, his vicious snarls echoing against the wooden walls. Wyatt was off his cot before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dark, the lever-action Winchester rifle already gripped tightly in his calloused hands. His frontier instincts screamed a warning before his mind fully comprehended the threat. Then, he smelled it. It was a scent that chilled the blood of any man trying to survive the arid West. The acrid, terrifying stench of burning pitch and dry pine, thick and suffocating. "Fire!" he bellowed, his gravelly voice tearing through the quiet cabin with the force of a physical blow. "Get up! There's a fire in the yard." He kicked open the heavy front door and froze, the Winchester half raised. The night sky, which should have been a canvas of absolute black, was glowing a hellish, violent shade of orange. The main barn, the lifeblood structure that housed their irreplaceable winter feed, the expensive draft horses, and the newly repaired farming equipment, was entirely engulfed in leaping flames. The heat hit him like a physical wall. Through the swirling smoke, shadows darted frantically around the perimeter of the blaze. They were men on horseback, their faces obscured by bandanas, tossing empty kerosene cans into the dry brush to accelerate the inferno. Josephine emerged from her room, moving with a startling, immediate clarity. Her dark hair cascaded in an untamed wave down her back, a heavy wool shawl thrown hastily over her white cotton nightgown. She did not scream. She did not weep or paralyze in panic. Her dark eyes instantly locked onto the massive inferno, her sharp mind calculating the trajectory of the blowing embers and the wind direction. "The wind is blowing south, away from the main house, but it's driving straight toward the dry brush near the cattle pens," she yelled, her voice a sharp, commanding crack of authority that cut cleanly through the roar of the fire. "Abigail!" The 12-year-old was already scrambling down the wooden ladder, her face pale with terror, clutching the hands of her younger brothers. Samuel was entirely silent, his eyes wide and unblinking, while little Levi whimpered into his sister's skirt. "Abigail, listen to me," Josephine commanded, dropping to her knees to meet the girl's terrified gaze. "Take Samuel and Levi down to the root cellar beneath the floorboards. You lock it from the inside, and you do not come out until I open the door myself. Do you understand me?" "But I can help," Abigail started, her voice trembling as she looked toward the glowing orange window. "You will protect your brothers. That is your job tonight," Josephine stated, her tone brokering absolutely no defiance, though her hands gently squeezed the girl's trembling shoulders. "Go. Right now." As the children vanished into the safety of the dark cellar beneath the kitchen, Wyatt sprinted into the chaotic yard. He fired a deafening warning shot from his Winchester straight into the smoky air, the sharp crack momentarily silencing the roar of the flames. The riders at the edge of the property didn't even attempt to engage. They wheeled their panicked horses around and scattered into the oppressive darkness, their cowardly, devastating work finished. Old Horace stumbled out of the bunkhouse, violently coughing, hauling a sloshing, heavy wooden bucket from the cast-iron pump. "The horses! Boss!" the old man bellowed, his voice cracking with despair. "The draft team is still locked inside the stalls." The heat radiating from the dying barn was monstrous, blistering the exposed skin on their faces and hands. The massive overhead roof beams were groaning in agony, raining a deadly shower of orange sparks down onto the dry, packed dirt. Wyatt didn't hesitate for a single second. He threw his rifle aside into the dust and lunged toward the water trough, soaking his heavy canvas coat until it was dripping wet, then threw it over his head like a makeshift cowl. "Wyatt, no!" Josephine screamed, lunging forward and grabbing his arm with astonishing strength. "It's too far gone. You'll die in there. I can't lose this ranch," he roared back, his eyes wild with desperate determination. He pulled out of her grip, immediately diving headfirst into the smoke-filled, blazing maw of the barn. Josephine stood stranded in the yard, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. The seconds stretched into agonizing, unending hours. The horrific sound of the terrified horses shrieking inside the blazing structure was a sound she knew she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. Refusing to stand idle, she ran to the pump, her nightgown trailing in the mud, helping Horace frantically fill bucket after bucket. She threw heavy, sloshing waves of water onto the wooden side of the nearby chicken coop and the edge of the corral fence, desperately battling to prevent the fire from spreading to the rest of the property. Then, a massive, sickening crack split the night air. The main central roof beam of the barn finally gave way. It collapsed inward with a deafening, thunderous roar, sending a spectacular geyser of sparks hundreds of feet into the smoky sky. The structure folded in on itself in a wave of crushing heat. "Wyatt!" she screamed, dropping her wooden bucket. The polished, unshakable composure of the educated Eastern lady finally shattered completely. She ran toward the flames, the heat searing her lungs, entirely prepared to run into the collapsing inferno to drag him out. Before she could reach the door, a massive, terrifying shape emerged from the thick, roiling black smoke. It was the two enormous draft horses, blindfolded with torn, burlap feed sacks, kicking and thrashing wildly in their terror. Leading them, his clothes literally smoking, his face entirely blackened with thick soot, and his hands burned, was the rancher. He stumbled blindly into the yard and collapsed to his knees the absolute second they cleared the blazing doorway, gasping violently for clean air. His lungs hacking up dark soot, Josephine fell into the dirt directly beside him, her hands frantically checking his face, his arms desperately patting out the small, smoldering embers eating at the edges of his flannel shirt. "You fool," she sobbed, the tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her own face as she pressed her forehead firmly against his chest. "You absolute, stubborn fool. Got him out," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, coughing violently again. His heavy, burned arms came up to hold her tight, burying his face deep into the crook of her shoulder, inhaling the scent of her hair beneath the smell of the smoke. They sat there in the mud and the dirt, clinging to each other as they watched the rest of the barn burn down to its foundation, the flames slowly dying out as they consumed the last of the timber. But the true, twisted revelation of the night had yet to reveal itself, as a pale, gray dawn finally broke, casting a cold, sobering light over the smoldering, ruinous pile of ash. Horace was quietly kicking through the debris near the rear corral. He stopped abruptly and let out a sharp, low whistle. Wyatt and Josephine pushed themselves up from the porch steps and walked slowly over. Lying in the dirt, groaning in sheer agony, was a man. His right leg was horrifically pinned beneath a fallen, deeply charred corral fence post, and his leather duster was heavily scorched. It was Hiram Cobb, the ruthless, cold-eyed foreman of the Montgomery Empire. In the chaotic panic of his men fleeing the scene, Hiram's horse had violently spooked at the sudden, explosive flare of the roof collapsing. The animal had thrown him directly into the path of the falling, burning timber. His own men, the men he commanded, had abandoned him to burn alive rather than risk capture. Wyatt stood over him, staring down at the man who had actively tried to destroy his livelihood, burn his property, and murder his family in their beds. Slowly, deliberately, the rancher reached down for the heavy, iron crowbar resting in the dirt near the water trough. His eyes were dead and flat. "Wyatt," Josephine said softly, stepping cautiously beside him, her hand resting lightly on his tense forearm. "He tried to kill us," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly cold and hollow. "He poured kerosene on a building not 50 yards from where my children were sleeping." "I know," she replied, her gaze shifting down to the broken, weeping foreman. The unspoken law of the Wild West dictated that a horse thief or an arsonist met the end of a short rope. The hard karma of the frontier demanded immediate, bloody retribution. But a dead man cannot testify in a court of law. She slowly knelt beside Hiram, who flinched violently away from her, expecting a blow. "Mr. Cobb," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet whisper that carried more weight than a loaded gun. "Your wealthy employer paid you to burn us out, and then your own men left you to die in the very fire you set. We are going to lift this heavy beam. We are going to set your broken leg. And in return, you are going to sit before a federal marshal and tell him exactly who gave you the order." Hiram looked up at the cold, incredibly calculating eyes of the woman from Philadelphia, then over to the smoldering, black ruins of the barn he had destroyed. He swallowed hard, The fight completely drained from him, and slowly nodded his head. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main thoroughfare of Silver City when retribution finally arrived. It didn't sneak in under the cover of darkness. It rode right down the center of the street in broad daylight. United States Marshal Orlando Rube Robbins, a man whose reputation for uncompromising grit preceded him from Boise to the Nevada line, brought 3 heavily armed deputies with him. The town held its collective breath. Shopkeepers stepped out onto the wooden boardwalks, and the swinging saloon doors came to a standstill. Robbins didn't even cast a glance toward the local sheriff's office, a silent but damning indictment of the town's purchased law. Instead, the small posse rode straight through, their heavy draft horses kicking up thick plumes of alkaline dust as they headed directly for the Bitter Creek property. Out at the ranch, the air was still thick with the acrid smell of charred pine and impending justice. Hiram Cobb lay on a makeshift canvas cot on the shaded porch, his shattered leg bound tightly in rough wooden splints. The ruthless foreman looked pale, feverish, and entirely broken. He was weakly sipping a tin cup of hot chicken broth provided by the very Eastern bride he had intended to leave destitute in the ashes. When Marshal Robbins dismounted, his heavy silver spurs jingling against the hard-packed earth, Celeste stepped aside, her expression a mask of unreadable calm. Stoney stood firmly at her shoulder, a silent, imposing guardian. With the very real threat of the federal gallows hanging heavy in the sweltering afternoon air, Cobb spilled everything. He gave a full, sworn confession, his voice trembling as he detailed years of systematic extortion, the illegal damming of the public water tributary, and, finally, the direct, undeniable order from the cattle baron to burn the Rutherfords out. The lawman recorded every word in his leather notebook, his weathered face carved from stone. The reckoning struck the Silver Spur Saloon on a crowded, boisterous Friday night. Jebediah Sterling was holding court at his usual mahogany table in the back corner, a glass of imported bourbon in his hand, loudly boasting to his sycophants. The heavy swinging doors banged open, hitting the interior walls with a violent crack. The piano player stopped dead, his hands hovering over the keys. Marshal Robbins strode across the sawdust-covered floor, the silver star pinned to his leather vest catching the dim lamplight. He completely ignored the hired guns who nervously rested their hands on their holsters. They knew better than to draw on a federal lawman. Robbins slammed a heavily sealed federal warrant onto the table, splashing directly into a spilled puddle of whiskey. Jebediah raged, his thick face turning a mottled, furious purple. He threatened, he spat venom, and he immediately reached for his overstuffed wallet, attempting to buy his way out of the nuisance as he always had. But federal law was not a commodity for sale. Heavy iron handcuffs snapped around the baron's wrists, the sharp metallic click echoing with finality in the dead silence of the room. The fall of the corrupt empire was absolute. Weeks later, under the unforgiving gavel of federal Judge John Cummins in the territorial capital, the baron's arrogant facade crumbled completely. Found guilty of conspiracy, arson, and egregious federal land violations, Jebediah was sentenced to 10 grueling years in the territorial penitentiary. But the truest stroke of hard karma, the one that finally broke the baron's spirit, came via Celeste's meticulous ledgers. Because the fire had destroyed vital agricultural property and endangered livestock, the judge ordered the estate to pay full, immediate restitution. Jebediah's massive western grazing leases were abruptly revoked by the government. When the seized lands went up for public auction, Celeste was there, sitting quietly in the front row, wearing her modest, perfectly tailored blue dress. She used a newly secured loan against their guaranteed restitution to outbid every man in the room. When the gavel fell for the final time, the Bitter Creek Ranch legally swallowed the best grazing land of their former tormentor. Autumn soon brought a crisp, golden chill to the Bruneau Valley, washing the endless scrublands in vibrant hues of amber and rust. The ranch had completely transformed. A massive new barn built of fresh-cut timber stood proudly in the yard. The cattle were fat and thriving on the abundant spring water, and the small, chaotic cabin had become a genuine home, filled with warmth, the smell of baking bread, and the sound of children's laughter. One quiet evening, long after Abigail and the boys were asleep in the loft, Stoney stepped out onto the porch. Celeste was sitting in a wooden rocking chair, a heavy woven blanket draped across her lap, quietly watching the moon rise over the sprawling, silver-lit valley that now belonged to them. He pulled up a chair beside her, the silence between them comfortable and incredibly deep. Reaching out, his rough, calloused fingers gently intertwined with hers. "You never did pack those silk trunks," Stoney murmured, his voice a low, tender rumble in the cool night air. He looked at her profile, marveling at the sheer strength and grace etched into her features. Celeste turned her head, a soft, genuine smile illuminating her face in the moonlight. "I told you, my love. I was looking for a life, not a fairy tale, and I believe I have found exactly what I was looking for." He leaned in, kissing her deeply, the sweet, sharp scent of the pine trees surrounding them. The town had expected her to break. Instead, she had broken the valley to her will, forging an enduring dynasty out of dust, ledgers, and an unbreakable love. The Bruneau Valley never forgot the Eastern woman who arrived with a silk dress and an iron will. She didn't just save a failing ranch. She resurrected a broken family and brought down a corrupt, sprawling cattle empire. Their incredible story proves that sometimes the hardest karma is reserved for those who underestimate the quietest arrivals, and the deepest romance is forged in the fires of survival.